Aside from Hannibal, King Mithridates VI of Pontus was the most daunting opponent that the Roman Republic ever faced. This Near Eastern monarch claimed descent from both Cyrus the Great and Alexander the Great, and maintained that he was prophesied to unite the Hellenic world with the eastern kingdoms of Persia, expelling what he viewed as the barbaric Romans in the process. His court propaganda presented him as a messianic figure who the gods would use to drive out the meddlesome Romans, and he frequently touted supposed signs and miracles that indicated the presence of divine favor. One of the most miraculous was the appearance of a fantastic and irregularly shaped comet that illuminated the night sky for 70 days when he was born in 135 BCE. Yet even more prodigious was the appearance of another remarkable and abnormal comet in 119 BCE on his ascension to the throne, also said to brighten the entire sky for 70 days. The utility of these comets for a would-be Eastern liberator is made apparent by differing attitudes toward comets as divine omens. The Romans regarded them as presaging the onset of war and destruction, while Near Eastern cultures saw comets as the harbinger of a great leader. One may recall that about 100 years later, another child born in fulfillment of prophecies was said to have been born under a prodigious star in the Palestinian town of Bethlehem. Ancient sources from Rome and Pontus alike readily acknowledged the reality of both of Mithridates' comets, and their centrality to the king's propaganda indicates that they were a core tenet of his messaging. But thousands of years later, historians at the dawn of the modern era began to doubt the tale of these two fantastic comets. After all, it seemed too perfectly aligned with Mithridates' propaganda aims, and simply too implausible for the rational attitudes that prevailed among scholars in the latter half of the 19th century. To these learned men, the episode reeked of ancient mysticism and irrationality that had to be called into doubt by recent scientific advancements and a growing scholarly disposition to discount any stories that took divine intervention or miraculous occurrences at face value. So these comets were relegated to the status of myth, and historians felt comfortable stating with absolute certainty that they were fabrications of Mithridates' propagandists. But years later, a strange thing happened. When the ancient astrological records of Han China became available to Western scholars, it was noted that the Chinese had recorded two fabulously bright comets with irregular tails shaped like war banners that illuminated the night sky in 135 and 119, replicating the accounts of Roman and Near Eastern sources. Mithridates' comets had been real all along. The ancients may have erred in attributing them to divine providence, but the actual comets themselves certainly existed and were seen the world over. Scholars had drastically overstepped when they used increasing scientific knowledge to redefine rationality and eliminate any elements of the ancient past which seemed too implausible. This anecdote is illuminating, and while it should not be used to call all historical scholarship into question, it can serve as a warning against treating ancient sources with undue skepticism, even in areas where the sources speak of inexplicable occurrences which can only be explained as evidence of divine intervention. Unusual things do happen, and while they don't happen as often as usual things, it's the rarity of these unusual occurrences which causes them to be remembered, and might even lead ancients to begin telling a story about that event that is slowly embellished to become something else entirely. This brings us to the central question of this video. Was Romulus a complete fabrication, or is there a historic kernel of truth at the root of the legend? The two primary arguments made against the historicity of Romulus are that the received narratives are contradictory accounts littered with mythic elements, and also that human settlement in Rome far predates the 753 BCE date when he was said to have founded the city. We'll deal with each of these in turn to build a case not for the actual verifiable existence of the historical Romulus, but rather to punch holes in the prevailing reasons for skepticism and to show that it's plausible that a figure who inspired later legends could have actually existed. One of the most significant hurdles to accepting the potential historicity of Romulus is the fact that the narratives we possess today are not just contradictory, they're chock full of miraculous instances that make them unpalatable to the modern reader seeking a verifiable historical account. From his supposed divine parentage to being nursed by a wolf, much of the Romulus story seems implausible at best. But the presence of mythic elements is not enough to discount the entire story. Our first written accounts of Romulus don't appear until the mid-4th century BCE, while the best sources don't arrive until the imperial era, hundreds of years after the events described. Given this distance, and the fact that roughly 60 competing traditions involving Romulus and the foundations of Rome exist, it's not surprising that some embellishment has occurred. Another mark against the theory that the entire story is fictitious is that Romulus regularly engages in behavior that fell well short of Roman ideals, notably the murder of his brother Remus and the abduction of the Sabine women. The Romulus narrative also presents early Rome as being populated by runaway slaves and debtors, hardly an illustrious lineage that future mythmakers would include unless there was some element of truth to it. Counterintuitively, the sheer number of legends surrounding Romulus can actually be read as evidence that there is something true at the root of the tales. Though the heroes of these tales have different names, they're remarkably similar. The man celebrated as the key founder is remembered according to different traditions with a range of names, including Romos, Romus, Romilos, and, of course, Romulus, with most of these tales contending that he established the city sometime between 800 and 750 BCE. Furthermore, skepticism about the tales is not a new phenomenon. The Romans themselves seem to have doubted certain aspects of the legends and preserved only the stories that they found most compelling. One famous example of applying rationalism to Rome's founding myth is Livy's theory that Romulus and Remus could have been suckled by a prostitute instead of a she-wolf, as the Latin term lupa was slang for a woman engaged in the world's oldest profession. Romans had the ability to be rational about their own myths, and would have only preserved the traditions which seemed the most plausible, and they were just as willing to write fantastic elements out of the story as they were to write them in. In addition, it's worth remembering that many archaeological sites that were purportedly connected with Romulus were visible within the city, and could be visited by any Roman curious about the city's past. From the archaic hut of Romulus on the Palatine to the mysterious black stone in the Forum, the city was full of artifacts that boasted a connection to the heroic founder. Romans had a wide range of beliefs about the gods and their role in human affairs, but even the most skeptical never seem to have doubted the actual existence of Romulus himself, despite reservations they may have had about certain aspects of the story. Overt skepticism about Romulus is a modern phenomenon. The second primary rationale for doubting the existence of Romulus is that archaeology clearly shows that the hills along the Tiber, which would one day become Rome, were settled well before the age of Romulus. There's evidence of human habitation dating back to approximately 1600 BCE, over 800 years before Romulus. But while this appears to shut the door on Romulus being the founder of Rome, it actually presents an opportunity to examine what the ancients would have really meant when saying that Romulus founded Rome. In a world where the gods permeated every aspect of reality, founding a new city and creating a new community was just as much a religious activity as it was a physical one. If Romulus was a historical figure, then the foundations he laid were religious ones. He was the first to confirm a community's new relationship with its patron deities, not the first man to build a house on the Palatine. This runs counter to how we moderns think about what it means to create something, but the definition does fit comfortably within the milieu of the ancient past. Even the gods of ancient myth did not create from nothing. The deities of cultures as disparate as Greece, Babylon, and Japan, among many others, were all said to have created when they brought order to chaos, refining existing material into a neatly ordered world that was fit for humans and other creatures. Similarly, we can view Romulus's activity of creating a new community that would observe new rites and have obligations to specific patron deities as an act which brought these once separate communities out of disorder and into a newly sanctioned relationship with the divine. By these arcane rituals, the ancients would have believed that Romulus founded a new city, even though people had lived there for hundreds of years. This isn't how it always happened, of course. Sometimes a ruler like Alexander the Great, with a knack for urban planning, would create a new city where there had once been nothing. But this type of founding would have also involved ritual and sacrifice to the new city's patron deities that confirmed the new community's status. For further support of the idea that existing settlement was no barrier to the founding of a new city, we need look no further than the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, a city founded by Constantine the Great 1,000 years after Romulus, which officially bore the title of Nova Roma, or New Rome, but is today known to us as Constantinople. Constantine founded his grand Christian capital on the site of an already existing Greek city named Byzantium. Though a community already existed here, no one would dispute that Constantine founded Constantinople, much less the existence of Constantine, even though the narrative of his life in ancient sources also contains many miraculous occurrences said to be the work of supernatural forces, such as the divine apparition of the cross before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The analogy shouldn't be taken too far. It's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, but it is a useful tool for our purposes here, as we think about how the ancients would have thought. Another key piece of evidence backing the historicity of a Romulus-like figure is the spate of construction that archaeologists have dated to between 800 to 700 BCE that seems to indicate growing centralization of power in Proto-Rome. During this critical time period, unique votive artifacts have been uncovered, and a wall around the Palatine was constructed that could possibly mark the original Pomerium. But most intriguing is a regal house on the Palatine, which surpasses all of the other dwellings of the time period, and could indicate the emergence of a king-like figure. If this is the case, then whatever his name was, this may well have been the inspiration for Romulus. As we conclude, I want to emphasize that holding to a historical Romulus is a minority position among scholars today. But the goal of this video is not to sell you on his literal existence. Instead, we want to encourage you to think about how you evaluate evidence from the ancient world. Ultimately, there's very little concrete proof either for or against the existence of Romulus. So while agnosticism is probably the most historically rigorous approach, I can't help but yield a little to the romantic notion that the stories Romans told themselves about themselves had a grain of truth at their center. In 2020, a tomb was unexpectedly uncovered under the Roman Forum beneath an area once known as the Comitium, and later built over by Caesar's Senate House, the Curia Julia. Archaeologists unearthed an underground temple featuring an altar believed to be dedicated to Romulus that dated to the 6th century BCE. Inside the temple was a massive stone sarcophagus, but unfortunately, this tomb was empty and no body was found. Had Romulus ever been interred here, archaeologists just barely missed out on what could have been the biggest find since King Tutankhamun. So while new archaeological breakthroughs are still being made in Rome, Romulus himself remains just as elusive as ever. But before we render a definitive verdict on his historicity, we should remember that there are always discoveries to be made in the Eternal City.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.